mouthful right there, man. I don't know which point to harp on you just made, but let me go with this one then. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. Did we learn from that situation? Like that right there, I don't know if it was intentionally, was it government sponsored, uh to put in there to divert people away from the what we call the real deal. Because right now I felt like the byproduct of Black Lives Matter is going to be a lot of people that would never get involved in the movement again. They gave money, lots of money, for Black Lives Matter to run off with it, and they just gonna throw a wet blanket on all the other grassroots movements out there. And I feel like, how can we prevent in my opinion, I think it was kind of somewhat to a certain extent government sponsored to divert people from the real deal. Uh, like how can we be prepared to handle a situation? You mentioned something, but how can we be prepared to handle another situation like that, or to prevent another situation like that from happening again?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say that, I don't think that Black Lives Matter was a government sponsored trick to stop us from organizing, or to divert us from organizing. But what I do think is that people created a hashtag, people who had access to some resources, people who had access to some capital, and some know-how on how to make something like that fly, right? Something, make it popular, right?
Yeah.
They knew how to brand, as folks like to say now. And it took off. And it took off, during a moment where there was actually on the ground organizing happening. Because remember, it was during Trayvon Martin that the hashtag came out, and there was already organizing in the streets in Florida when Trayvon Martin was killed. In fact, in some ways, I think if I remember correctly, the NAACP, who I have a lot of criticism for, was on the ground leading a lot of that struggle when Trayvon Martin was killed, right? So
Yeah.
there was organizations already there. The hashtag took off on social media, and all of a sudden it became an umbrella slogan, almost like the Black Power, right, in the 60s
Yeah.
and 70s, right?
Mhm.
And it also, like Black Power, it wasn't necessarily well defined in a lot of people's mind. So for some people, Black Lives Matter meant one thing, and for others, it meant something else, right? And
Correct.
I think there was a time period, again, where there was a lot of people joining, obviously, liberal institutions, right? So let's be clear, liberal institutions, and that's everything from foundations to newspaper, adopted and embraced the Black Lives Matter movement. And this is where I think, if not necessarily a state conspiracy, a conspiracy of interest amongst the elite to capture the movement, right?
Okay.
Movement capture is real, as in we can give you resources, give you fame, give you publicity. And even if you think you're a socialist, you're going to succumb to all of that. And then you're going to start moving directly into policy work only. And for me, one of the major things that I think is a way in which the movement got captured, is that it went strictly into, or overwhelmingly into, electoral politics, which plays right back into whose hands? The Democratic Party's hands, which means we go right back using the energy of a movement that was on the street now into getting certain people elected to higher office, right? And although there were
Mm.
some challenges to that, and there were many of the affiliates of the Black Lives Matter chapters that broke off later on, because they were like, look, you got all that money, and all that money seems to be at the top. How come that money isn't being spread around to all the chapters? So I think there were real people, real organizers, sincere folks who joined the movement. I think there were real people, even with my criticism, who helped start that movement. But I do think in the end, there was a sense of movement capture. And as opposed to being organizers in the street, people got, let's say, seduced by resources and a certain limelight. And that led to the breakup of that movement, whereas there's still individual chapters, right, that people who operate under the name. But as far as a national sort of organization that's working, it doesn't exist now. But again, it goes to show that there are the possibilities are real for movement building. the possibilities are real for national organizing and international organizing. So we shouldn't take from it that it was something that necessarily diverted us from, but we should take from it, in my opinion, is that it was something that almost was. And then what are the mistakes, issues that had happened to make it captured or have it captured, and how can we avoid that again in the future?
Wow, wow. I'm glad you said that because uh, it's good to look back on those things in retrospect and see how can we reformulate the playbook because a lot of the stuff just happened overnight. It's like a spark, and next thing you know, it's like, oh my God, it took off. It's too late to even, get propaganda out about it. But with social media, things spread so fast now. So, um, it, I'm glad it's to a point where Black Lives Matter is people are finally caught on to okay, that's not the route to go anymore with all the things that came out. It just like it's feel like man, we got to get back out there, which is not a bad thing to do the groundwork to gain the trust of the people again because of Black Lives Matter. Um, and it just and I think I think a reason Black Lives Matter happened too is because honestly, I think a lot of the other grassroots movement wasn't doing
Yeah,
their part, you
no,
know.
I think that's true.
Um,
It real quickly,
yeah,
there was a point where um, uh, my organization that I was with at the time, a little bit before that, I guess, the Malcolm X grassroots movement was like the leading grassroots black formation in the country.
mm,
And the organization Black Lives Matter sort of overtook that, and became more popular. Again, it did have certain resources to propel itself, but it did become more popular, right? And so again, we have to look at what were we doing and what we were not doing at that time
yeah,
period. And in time periods where, again, just recently, last year, the year before, the George Floyd uprising happened, again, where literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people took to the streets. And they didn't take to the streets under the umbrella of an organization called Black Lives Matter, right? People still are using that symbolism or that name for what they are doing. I personally don't use the name, right? I'm part of the Black Liberation Movement, um, uh, but I think that people still recognize the sort of symbolism of Black Lives Matter as a name to use, but as an
hmm
organizational entity, it wasn't even as prominent this time around, let's say, as it was after Trayvon and when Mike Brown was killed also. So I say all that to say is there's still grassroots movements or organizations in various cities and towns. Some of them are working individually, and some of these conversations we've already had. Part of our role is to link up. Part of our
yeah,
role is to join with each other, is to figure out ways to work closer together so that we can create a national network, if not a national organization, that's in a position to say when these things are happening, we're already on the ground, right? We're not. There's not people who are going to sort of swoop in or come with a hashtag and begin to be leaders of a movement. We already have folks on the ground who are linked up. And that's the way the folks who are doing work locally create national movements, right? So there's no reason why we don't have a national coordinating committee of the different groups that are doing work on the ground so that we can be prepared for not only if or when another incident happens, but in spite of an incident happening, we're creating our own momentum on the ground, right? Because we're
yeah,
doing work that's already needed to get done. And we're using the tools of social media to spread the word that these things are happening, right? But that's only going to happen, in my estimation, is when, in America, a lot of times for organizing, because people see the access to branding or the amount of shine they may get in media, or even or using things like Twitter and all the rest of it. Like there's an egoism that's been in movement for a while, right? But there's
hmm
an egoism that keeps us apart, whether we like it or not, that says I'd rather be the leader of my organization, which has 7 or 8 people, than being one of several leaders in an organization that has 50 or 60 people. And then you can exponentially, keep climbing up that ladder as long as people are in a position of willing to share leadership, share ideas, take criticism, receive criticism, give criticism, and still hold the group together. Right? To me,
Yep.
there's nothing more important when we talk about this stuff than saying how do we hold the organization together that we've built through disputes, through negative things that may happen, because it's the breaking up of those organizations that other factors love to happen, want to see happen, want to take down. And we can only build a successful liberation movement when we understand it is the unity of organizing that has to survive more than personalities, more than ego. And I think that's one of the things that, even more so than other organizations sort of swooping in, I think that's one of the things that's really telltale of when we're really ready and sincere about building a liberation movement, is when we have a liberation movement that's on the ground, that's in local communities, but that's tied together nationally and again internationally.